The ground burns through the soles of his shoes. Not in an unbearable way, more like a warning he chooses to ignore because everyone around him is taking photos. The air smells of sulfur, and white columns of vapor rise in front of him, blending into the gray sky. Lucas Ferreira adjusts the camera, smiles, frames the crater. What an incredible place, he thinks. The guide stands a few meters ahead, pointing toward the sulfur-stained rock walls, explaining something about geothermal activity, and then the ground shifts. A small vibration, almost imperceptible, and the vapor in front of him changes color. In a fraction of a second, the world around him explodes. If stories like this keep you watching until the end, subscribe and leave a like. Because every detail matters here. Lucas Ferreira wasn't the kind of person who chased adventure. At 38, he worked as a software engineer for a logistics company in Sao Paulo, lived a predictable routine, woke up early, drank the same coffee, took the same train every morning. The trip to New Zealand had been planned for almost 2 years, not as an escape but as a reward, a place he had seen in photos and decided that one day he needed to see for himself, with his own eyes, with enough time to actually look. He arrived in Auckland on a Thursday, with 3 weeks ahead of him and an itinerary that included Queenstown, Milford Sound, and the northern coast. White Island wasn't part of the original plan. It found its way in on a rainy afternoon, when Lucas stepped into a travel agency in downtown Auckland more to get out of the rain than with any real intention of buying anything. The brochure was displayed in the window. A steaming volcanic crater, tourists wearing yellow helmets, the text describing it as a unique experience on active volcanic ground. He walked in, asked for the price, and bought the ticket. The logic was simple and completely reasonable. If there was an agency selling that tour, if there were trained guides, if there was safety equipment, if tourists from all over the world were doing it regularly, then it had to fall within what was considered acceptable. Lucas wasn't ignoring a risk. He was trusting a system that had apparently assessed that risk and concluded it was manageable. That distinction might seem subtle now, but it will make complete sense later. On the boat leaving Whakatane the next morning, there were 46 other people besides Lucas, couples, families, groups of friends, solo travelers. Everyone excited, everyone with cameras ready. The sea was rough and a few people got sick, but the guide said that was normal for that route. She handed out the equipment with practiced ease, a yellow helmet, a compact gas mask, both to be kept on the belt unless she told them to use it. She didn't specify under what circumstances she would. Lucas put on the helmet, clipped the mask to his belt, and went back to looking out the window toward the island as it approached. The smoke was visible from a distance, white columns rising from the center of the crater against the gray sky. There was something genuinely impressive about it, a sense of scale that photos couldn't capture. He took pictures of the island from the boat, thinking he needed to document every step if he wanted to tell the story properly later. The landing took place on a small metal platform fixed to the rock, and the first step onto the island felt immediately different from anything Lucas had experienced before. The ground was dark and uneven, with the texture of something that had melted and solidified over and over again. The smell of sulfur hit instantly, strong enough to sting the eyes for a few seconds. But everyone around him was walking normally, so Lucas walked normally too, adjusted his pace behind the guide and started paying attention to what she was explaining. 20 minutes inside the island and the discomfort had already become familiar. This is a process that happens automatically in the human brain when no immediate danger presents itself. What was strange becomes normal, what was uncomfortable becomes acceptable, what was a signal turns into background. Lucas had stopped noticing the smell of sulfur in the same way someone stops noticing the sound of an office air conditioner. It's still there, but the nervous system decides it no longer needs to report it consciously. The ground burned. Not in an unbearable way, more like hot asphalt in the summer. That heat rising through the sole of the shoe that feels wrong but not wrong enough to stop. Lucas noticed it when he stayed in the same spot a little longer to take a photo, and realized the heat had become uncomfortable. He stepped to the side, found a slightly cooler patch and kept going. He didn't say anything to the guide. There was nothing to say. The ground of an active volcano being hot felt exactly like what an active volcano should be. The guide led the group toward the center of the crater, where the acid lake sat, the main attraction of the tour, the image shown in every piece of promotional material. She explained the chemical composition of the lake, how the turquoise color came from dissolved minerals, talked about the surface temperature. Lucas listened halfway, more focused on framing his shots. The vapor had increased slightly compared to the entrance, but still within what the guide had described as normal variation. When someone asked, there was a specific moment, one Lucas would later remember with uncomfortable clarity, when the thought crossed his mind that something about the place felt wrong. Not wrong as in dangerous, but wrong as in alien, like another planet, like a place that didn't feel built for people. The thought lasted less than 3 seconds and was replaced by adjusting the angle of the lake in the frame. His brain registered it as unusual, not as a threat. The vapor ahead shifted, thickened for a few seconds, then thinned again. The guide kept talking at the same pace. Someone asked if they should put the masks on, and she said it wasn't necessary yet, that she would tell them if it was. The answer reassured everyone. It came from someone with authority in that environment, someone who had been there dozens of times before. The question that had started to form stayed unspoken, and Lucas went back to taking photos. What no one there could perceive, because there was simply no way to without instruments, was that the geothermal system beneath them was in a different state than usual, not catastrophically different, not in a way surface sensors would clearly detect, but different enough. Groundwater, in contact with magmatic heat, had been building pressure in a way that wasn't dissipating as it normally would. It was being held, waiting for a point of rupture. That point was getting close, and there was absolutely no way to know it from above. The group had reached the innermost point of the tour, the edge of the acid lake, the best viewing position, the place where the guide always stopped for the final explanation before heading back. Lucas stood a few meters to the left of her, trying a different angle for the photo, slightly removed from the center of the group. The vapor rose straight up in front of him, and the green surface of the lake reflected the gray sky in a way that had worked well in 3 consecutive shots. The change started in the ground. Not a tremor, but a vibration, something different, closer to the feeling of standing near a speaker with heavy bass. That pressure you feel in your chest before you even hear it. Lucas looked down instinctively, not understanding what he was feeling. The ground beneath his feet had become noticeably hotter in just a few seconds. Not gradually, but all at once, as if something had been switched on below the surface. He lifted his eyes and saw the vapor change. The right word wasn't increase, it was transform. What had been a relatively steady column throughout the visit became something with a different texture, a different density, a different speed as it rose. It took less than 2 seconds for the visibility in front of him to drop significantly. Lucas blinked, tried to make sense of what he was seeing, and that's when the guide shouted. She shouted in English, a short word, but the command was unmistakable. The group moved, not in organized panic, but in the kind of motion that happens when 40 people enter a state of alert at the same time in a confined space. Collisions, shoves, conflicting directions. Lucas took a step toward the group, and in that same second, the pressure hit. Not an explosion with a warning sound, but an instant transformation of the air around him. From heavy to unbearable, from warm to scalding, faster than the mind could process what was happening. The heat struck the left side of his face and both forearms at the same time. Not like fire, but like thermal pressure, like being pressed against an extremely hot surface. Lucas stepped back, lost his balance, dropped to one knee on the uneven ground. The mist was almost total now, white, dense, no visible direction, no spatial reference of voices around him, but impossible to tell where they were coming from. The gas mask hung from his belt, just inches from his hand, but the movements were no longer precise. There was a moment of internal silence that didn't match the environment. Sound everywhere, but Lucas's brain had shifted into a different processing state, the kind that filters out everything except immediate survival input. There was no thinking, only assessment, heat, direction, balance, movement. Somewhere below conscious thought, the body made the decision, get up and move. Lucas pushed himself up, his arms burning in a way that hadn't yet turned into pain. It was heat, sensation, information. The pain would come later, when the nerves affected by the superheated vapor began to respond fully. For now, there was only urgency and disorientation inside a white haze that showed nothing beyond a few meters in any direction. He shouted, asked for direction, and a voice answered, the guide, a few meters ahead. pulling the group toward the exit. The way back was the same path they had taken in, but the ground had changed. Hot ash covered sections of the terrain, not deep, but enough to make every step uncertain. Rocks had been shifted by the blast. The heat radiating from the ground was stronger than before, and Lucas could feel it through the soles of his shoes in a way that made him move faster without realizing. He kept his eyes on the feet of the person in front, looked at nothing else. There was a woman beside him who had fallen and wasn't getting up at the same pace. Lucas didn't know her, just another face from the group that had arrived on the same boat, part of that set of people who become familiar without names. The instinct to stop overrode the instinct to keep moving, and he stopped, crouched down, grabbed her arm, helped her up. She said something he couldn't understand. They moved together. The guide was ahead, calling out to the group. Not in panic, but with clear urgency, the tone of someone managing a critical situation and aware that everyone's behavior depends on it. Lucas followed that voice like a fixed direction. He didn't think about the boat, didn't think about anything, just followed the sound. The ground still burned. The air remained heavy with ash and vapor. Visibility started to improve a few meters ahead. As they moved out of the most affected area, the dock came into view. The boat came into view. The crew that had stayed at the landing point were shouting instructions, signaling with wide gestures. Lucas climbed the metal ramp with legs already at their limit, stepped onto the boat and didn't even manage to sit. He dropped. His body simply stopped responding under that level of strain. Around him, other survivors did the same. Someone was crying. Someone else was completely silent. Someone was calling out for a person who hadn't made it yet. The engine kicked in. Lucas looked at his arms for the first time since the blast and saw the extent of what had happened. Deep red from elbow to wrist on the left arm, blisters beginning to form. It didn't hurt yet the way it would in the hours ahead. He lowered his arms, looked back at the island fading behind them, still smoking with the same indifference as before, and couldn't form a single thought that made sense. The hospital in Auckland treated Lucas for second-degree burns covering much of his left forearm and the back of his right hand. The doctor who handled his initial care said he had been lucky with his position, that the main force of the blast had passed just slightly to his side. Lucas didn't know what to do with that information. Lucky in a situation that had killed other people in the same place at the same moment just meters away. In the days that followed, lying in a hospital bed with bandages on his arms and a white ceiling as his only horizon, Lucas absorbed the information in fragments, through news reports, conversations with doctors, messages that began arriving once his family in Sao Paulo found out. 22 people had died that day in December 2019. Another 25 had been hospitalized with severe burns. Some would spend months in intensive care. Some wouldn't survive the complications. The investigation that followed revealed that the volcano had shown signs of increased activity in the days before. Data recorded by monitoring instruments indicating changes in the geothermal system. The alert level had been classified as 2 on a scale of 1 to 5 that morning, which, according to established protocols, still allowed visits. The tour company had checked the alert level before departure. The tour proceeded within the applicable rules. Everything had been done correctly within the existing system, and still it had gone irreversibly wrong. Lucas kept thinking about that phrase, within the existing system. There had been a system. The system had been consulted. The system had said it was fine. And now there were 22 people dead, 25 hospitalized, and Lucas with burns that would take months to heal, leaving permanent scars. The system hadn't failed out of negligence, hadn't failed out of bad intent. It had failed because no system can predict the behavior of an active volcano with certainty. That was the part that took Lucas the longest to process. Not in the weeks that followed, but in the months and years after, when the story settled into something he could carry. He hadn't done anything wrong in the conventional sense. He had researched, he had checked, he had trusted professionals with authority over that environment. The decision to enter the crater had seemed completely reasonable based on the information available. And still, it had almost cost everything. When he returned to Sao Paulo months later, the bandages gone but the scars still visible on his arms, Lucas didn't tell the story right away. It took time to find the right words. Not for what had happened, but for what it meant. He had learned something about the difference between allowed and safe, between probable and certain, between an approved system and a risk-free one. Distinctions that feel small when everything is fine and stop feeling small when the ground erupts beneath your feet. Inside a volcano you paid to enter,